You have been told your entire life that Jesus came to gather followers, that being a good Christian means attending church on Sunday, reading your Bible faithfully, praying before meals, believing the correct doctrines, and trying your best to live a moral life. You were taught that to follow Jesus means loyalty, obedience, devotion, and placing him at the center as your leader and savior. But what if the very definition of following that you inherited is the very thing keeping you from what he actually intended? It sounds radical, maybe even uncomfortable, but take a moment and look carefully at the gospel accounts. Every time the crowds tried to crown him king, he withdrew. When they wanted to elevate him into a political or religious authority figure, he disappeared into the hills. When people attempted to turn him into a symbol of power, he walked away. That does not look like someone building a movement based on dependency and blind allegiance. It looks like someone resisting being turned into an idol. Even more striking is how often he criticized the religious leaders of his day. These were people who already had followers. They had structure, hierarchy, tradition, and control. Yet Jesus called them hypocrites, blind guides, whitewashed tombs. He exposed a system that had perfected the art of religious performance while missing the living reality of God. They had mastered rule-keeping but lost the heart of transformation. And then he said something that should have shaken everything. The kingdom of heaven is within you, not above you, not locked inside a temple, not controlled by priests, within you. That single statement dismantles every structure built on spiritual dependency. If the kingdom is within, then access is not external, authority is not monopolized, divinity is not distant. So what did he mean when he said, "Follow me"? For centuries we have interpreted those words through the lens of hierarchy. He leads, we trail behind. He is special, we are separate. He is divine, we are merely human. But what if that framework is incomplete? What if the issue is not the word follow, but our misunderstanding of what it meant in his culture and time? The modern image of a follower is someone who submits permanently, who remains a student forever, who never rises beyond imitation. But what if Jesus was not calling people into lifelong dependency? What if he was inviting them into transformation so profound that it would eventually erase the distance between teacher and disciple? This is where the story becomes dangerous, because a person who believes God lives within them cannot be easily controlled. A person who realizes the kingdom is internal does not need constant mediation. But a person who believes they must always look outward for access to God will always depend on a system. The real question is not whether you have followed Jesus. The real question is whether you have understood what he wanted you to become. To understand what Jesus meant when he said, "Follow me," we have to step out of our modern assumptions and enter the world of first-century Judaism. Because in that culture, those two words did not mean what we think they mean today. They were not a call to blind obedience. They were not an invitation to permanent subordination. They were something far more radical. In the rabbinic tradition of that time, when a rabbi invited someone to follow him, it was an extraordinary moment. Not everyone was chosen. Young boys would study Torah intensely, and only the most promising would be invited to continue under a rabbi's direct teaching. When a rabbi looked at someone and said, "Follow me," he was making a powerful statement. "I believe you can become like me." That was the goal. Not admiration, not dependency, becoming. A disciple did not simply memorize teachings. He observed how the rabbi walked, how he spoke, how he responded to conflict, how he prayed, how he embodied the presence of God. The disciple's aim was to so fully absorb the rabbi's way of being that one day he could carry that same spirit into the world and teach others. The highest honor was not staying a follower forever. The highest honor was maturing into a reflection of the teacher. There was even a saying in that culture, "May you be covered in the dust of your rabbi." It meant walking so closely with your teacher that the dust from his sandals would settle on you. But the purpose of walking that closely was not to remain in his shadow. It was to learn to walk the path yourself. So when Jesus stood before fishermen, tax collectors, ordinary men with no elite religious training and said, "Follow me," he was not asking them to become lifelong spiritual spectators. He was declaring that they had the capacity to become what he was. That is why this invitation was so shocking. He did not choose the religious elite. He chose those the system had overlooked and said, in essence, "You can carry this." This also explains a statement that confuses many believers today. Jesus told his disciples, "Greater works than these will you do." Think about how bold that is. If his goal had been to establish permanent superiority, he would never have said such a thing. But if his goal was replication rather than admiration, it makes perfect sense. He was preparing them to step into the same consciousness, the same authority, the same intimacy with the Father that he embodied. The dangerous part was never the word follow. The dangerous part was what it implied, because if disciples can become like the rabbi, hierarchy begins to collapse. If ordinary people can access divine consciousness directly, the gatekeepers lose their power. If the kingdom truly lives within, then the role of intermediary shrinks dramatically. This is why the message carried such explosive potential. It was not merely spiritual comfort. It was a quiet revolution. It redefined the relationship between humanity and the divine. It suggested that what people saw in Jesus was not a performance reserved for one unique individual, but a demonstration of what humanity looks like fully awakened. And once you see that, you cannot unsee it. Because follow me stops sounding like stay behind me and starts sounding like walk the same path until you stand where I stand. In the years immediately after Jesus' death, something electric filled the air. The people who had walked with him were not simply preserving memories, they were carrying an experience. They had heard his voice, watched him pray, felt the intensity of his presence. What burned inside them was not merely belief, it was encounter. They did not gather because they were maintaining an institution. They gathered because something alive had awakened within them. In those earliest days, the movement was fluid and organic. They met in homes, broke bread together, shared stories, prayed with expectation. The focus was not on hierarchy or titles. It was on transformation. They spoke about the Spirit not as an abstract doctrine, but as a present reality. They did not describe themselves as distant admirers of Jesus. They described Christ as living within them. The language was intimate, immediate, experiential. But time has a way of shifting movements. Decades passed. One by one, the original witnesses died. The ones who had directly encountered Jesus were no longer there to transmit that living fire from soul to soul. What remained were letters, testimonies, fragments of memory attempting to capture something that had once been embodied. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the center of gravity began to move. It is far more difficult to control a people who believe God lives within them than a people who believe they must go through an external authority to reach him. When the original flame began to fade from direct experience into written record, structure stepped in. Meetings in living rooms gradually became gatherings in formal spaces. Informal leadership evolved into official offices. Titles emerged, systems formed. This was not necessarily born from evil intention. Structure often arises from the desire to preserve. But preservation can quietly become control. What was once a movement of awakened individuals began to solidify into an institution. The emphasis shifted from becoming like Christ to believing the correct things about Christ. Transformation slowly gave way to tradition. Awakening was replaced by adherence. The message that the kingdom is within became more abstract, more theological, less immediate. Instead of encouraging people to discover divine presence in themselves, the focus moved toward proper participation in rituals, correct confession of doctrine, loyalty to established authority. The revolutionary edge of follow me was softened into something safer. Admire him, worship him, depend on authorized interpreters. And it worked. Over time, the idea that ordinary people could embody the same divine consciousness Jesus embodied began to feel dangerous, even inappropriate. What had once been the core invitation became a theological tension. The distance between Jesus and his followers widened. He was lifted higher and higher, while humanity was taught to stay small. The tragedy is not that organization developed. The tragedy is that in the process the original intensity of becoming was overshadowed. A living path risked becoming a belief system. A transformative journey risked becoming a religious identity. The flame that once leapt from heart to heart was increasingly contained within walls. Yet beneath the layers of structure and tradition, the original invitation never completely disappeared. It remained embedded in the words, waiting for those willing to look deeper. The shift from awakening to institution may have changed the form, but it could not fully erase the seed planted at the beginning. There is a moment in the Gospels that most readers move past without realizing how revolutionary it truly is. The disciples approach Jesus and say, "Lord, teach us to pray." On the surface, it sounds simple. They are asking for words, a formula, a spiritual routine. But within the first-century rabbinic context, their request carries far greater depth. They are not merely asking how to speak to God, they are asking how to connect the way He connects. In that culture, prayer was not primarily about presenting requests. It was about alignment. It was about tuning one's consciousness to the frequency of the divine. When they watched Jesus withdraw into solitude and return with clarity, authority, and compassion, they were witnessing more than devotion. They were witnessing union, and they wanted to understand how to enter that same state. So when Jesus responded with what we now call the Lord's Prayer, He was not handing them a script to recite mechanically. He was unveiling a pathway of awareness. Our Father who art in heaven was not meant to create distance, but intimacy. It redefined their identity at the very beginning. Not servants begging a distant ruler, but children recognizing their origin. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, was not a passive hope for a future event. It was an invitation to embody heaven here and now, to let divine will express itself through human action. Every line carried transformative power. Give us this day our daily bread was not just about physical provision. It was about trust. It was about releasing anxiety and entering dependence on divine flow. Forgive us, as we forgive, was about clearing the internal blockages that keep consciousness fragmented. This prayer was not designed to impress God. It was designed to awaken the one praying. Then Jesus said something that makes even more sense in this light. When you pray, go into your closet and shut the door. Why secrecy? Because what he was teaching could not be reduced to performance. This was not a public display of piety. It was inner transformation. The real shift happens in hidden spaces where ego quiets and awareness deepens. In that silence, something remarkable becomes possible. The recognition that the same Spirit animating Jesus is present within you. Pause and consider the magnitude of that claim. The same divine life that flowed through Jesus of Nazareth flows through you. Not symbolically, not poetically, existentially. Prayer, as he taught it, was the doorway into that realization. It was never about maintaining distance between humanity and God. It was about dissolving the illusion of separation. Yet over time, even prayer was ritualized. Words meant to ignite awareness became memorized phrases repeated without reflection. What was meant to awaken became something recited. The doorway remained, but many forgot what it was designed to open. And still, the invitation has not vanished. The method remains embedded in his teaching, waiting to be practiced not as tradition, but as encounter. Because if prayer is truly alignment with divine consciousness, then it is not about becoming more religious, it is about becoming more real. Imagine the emotional devastation of that week. The teacher they had left everything to follow was executed publicly and brutally. The one they believed carried the hope of Israel hung on a cross like a criminal. Every expectation collapsed in a matter of hours. The disciples were not bold visionaries in that moment. They were shattered men hiding behind locked doors, terrified that they would be next. Everything they thought they understood about Jesus seemed to have ended in failure. And then something happened that redefined reality for them. When Jesus appeared after the crucifixion, the significance was deeper than the simple fact that he was alive. Yes, the resurrection shattered their despair. Yes, it overturned their assumption that death had the final word. But look carefully at how he appeared and what he emphasized. He did not return demanding worship. He did not say, "Now you see that I alone am unique and unreachable." Instead, he did something far more profound. He allowed Thomas to touch his wounds. He ate with them. He appeared in locked rooms. He moved beyond physical limitation, yet remained tangible. These were not theatrical displays meant to inspire awe alone. They were demonstrations. He was revealing what human existence looks like when fully united with divine life. He was showing them that what they thought was exclusively his identity was, in fact, a revelation of humanity's potential. Then he spoke words that should have permanently altered the trajectory of Christian history. As the Father has sent me, so I send you. That statement is staggering. He did not say, admire what I have done. He said, continue what I have begun. The sending was symmetrical. The same relationship he lived in with the Father became the model for theirs. The same mission he embodied became theirs to carry. And then he breathed on them. That detail is not poetic decoration. Breath, from the beginning of Scripture, symbolizes life and spirit. Just as breath animated the first human in Genesis, Jesus breathing on his disciples symbolized the transfer of living consciousness. It was not about establishing a chain of command. It was about awakening what had always been dormant within them. In that moment, the shift from followers to embodiments began to crystallize. Only then did it start to make sense. Follow me had never meant remain behind me forever. It meant walk the path until you stand in the same union. Resurrection was not merely proof of divinity. It was revelation of destiny. It was a declaration that divine life is not fragile, not limited, not confined to one historical figure. It is the deepest truth of existence itself. This is why Paul could later write, "It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me." That is not the language of distant admiration. It is the language of identification. This is why early believers spoke of being in Christ, and Christ being in them. Something fundamental had shifted. They no longer saw Jesus as a separate spiritual celebrity. They began to understand him as the first fully awakened expression of what humanity is meant to become. For a brief moment in history, the implications were explosive. If resurrection life is not confined to one man, then the dividing line between sacred and ordinary dissolves. If the same Spirit lives within all, then access to God is immediate. But such an idea is difficult to institutionalize. It resists control. It empowers individuals in ways that threaten rigid hierarchy. And that is where the tension begins to build again. As the decades passed and the first generation of eyewitnesses faded from the earth, Christianity stood at a crossroads. The men and women who had experienced Jesus as a living presence were gone. What remained were their letters, their testimonies, their attempts to describe encounters that words could barely contain. But description is not the same as experience. A story about fire is not the same as standing in its heat. Without the original carriers of that living flame, something subtle began to shift. The movement that once spread through intimate gatherings and personal transformation gradually moved toward structure. Leaders emerged not only as guides but as authorities. Communities sought stability. Beliefs were defined more precisely. Boundaries were drawn. What had once been fluid became formal. Then history introduced a decisive moment. When Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity in 312 AD, the faith that had once been a persecuted movement of radical transformation suddenly found itself aligned with imperial power. What had survived through sacrifice now had the protection of the state. On the surface, it seemed like victory. But protection comes with a price. When a movement built on inner awakening becomes tied to political structure, its message often changes tone. Councils were convened to define doctrine. Creeds were formulated to establish orthodoxy. This in itself was not inherently wrong. Clarity can protect truth. But alongside clarification came consolidation. Authority became centralized. Access to spiritual interpretation narrowed. The living flame was increasingly placed inside institutional containers. The original emphasis on direct divine experience slowly gave way to correct belief about divine realities. Instead of asking, how do we embody what Jesus embodied? The question became, do you agree with the official formulation? Theology began to overshadow transformation. Identity shifted from awakened participant to loyal adherent. The implications were enormous. If divine consciousness is something accessible within, then every individual carries sacred authority. But if access is mediated primarily through institution, sacrament, and hierarchy, then power consolidates upward. The distance between Jesus and the average believer widened. He was elevated as uniquely divine in a way that made imitation feel impossible rather than inevitable. What had once been an invitation to become began to feel like a command to worship. The radical possibility that ordinary men and women could live in the same union with God that Jesus demonstrated became suspicious, even dangerous. Claims of direct spiritual insight could be labeled heresy. Awakening was reframed as arrogance, and yet, even as structures hardened, the original words remained in the texts. The kingdom of heaven is within you. Greater works than these will you do. As the Father has sent me, so I send you. The code was still there, embedded in plain sight. No council could fully erase it, no empire could delete it. The monument may have been erected, but beneath the stone, the ember still glowed. History did not completely extinguish the original invitation. It obscured it. It layered it with doctrine, ritual, and hierarchy. But truth has a way of resurfacing, especially in times of spiritual hunger. And whenever individuals begin to read the words of Jesus without inherited filters, the old fire begins to flicker again. The question now is not what happened in the 4th century. The question is whether the flame can burn clearly again in this century. After everything we have walked through, one truth begins to emerge with startling clarity. Jesus did not move through villages, heal the sick, challenge religious systems, and endure crucifixion simply to gather admirers. He was not building a fan base. He was igniting a revelation, and that revelation was not about elevating himself above humanity, but about revealing what humanity is capable of when fully awakened. If we strip away centuries of inherited assumptions and return to his actual words, the pattern becomes undeniable. He consistently pointed beyond surface identity. He spoke of oneness with the Father. He declared that the kingdom was within. He told his disciples they would do greater works. He sent them as he had been sent. These are not the words of someone establishing permanent spiritual distance. They are the words of someone collapsing it. What he wanted were mirrors, living reflections of the same divine consciousness he embodied. Men and women who would not merely quote his teachings, but incarnate them. People who would look at his life and say, if that union is possible for him, it is possible for me. Not in ego, not in rivalry, but in realization. This is why love was always central. Not rule-keeping, not ritual precision. Love of God and love of neighbor were inseparable because awakened consciousness expresses itself as compassion. When someone truly understands that divine life flows through them, cruelty becomes irrational. Fear loses its grip. Separation begins to dissolve. The fruit of awakening is not superiority, it is radical humility and courage at the same time. Imagine how threatening that vision is to any system built on control. A world filled with individuals who know they are temples of the living God does not depend on intermediaries for identity. They can gather, yes. They can learn, yes. But they are not spiritually dependent in the same way. Their authority flows from inner communion, not external validation. This is why the shift toward worship without embodiment subtly altered the trajectory. Worship is beautiful when it flows from recognition, but when worship replaces becoming, something essential is lost. Jesus did not demonstrate divine life so that humanity would admire it from a distance. He demonstrated it so humanity would awaken to it within. The most revolutionary idea is not that Jesus was divine. The most revolutionary idea is that divinity and humanity are not opposites. In him they were united visibly. And his invitation was not, stand back and celebrate my uniqueness. It was, walk this path until you discover your own union. He did not want followers who remain perpetually behind him. He wanted equals in consciousness, participants in the same flow of spirit. He did not want spectators of miracles. He wanted embodiments of love. He did not want a world full of believers alone. He wanted a world transformed by awakened beings. And that leads us to a deeply personal question. If this has been the invitation all along, then what does it require from you now? Now the path turns inward. After everything we have uncovered, the question is no longer historical. It is personal. If Jesus did not come to create permanent followers but awakened embodiments, then the responsibility shifts. It no longer rests on institutions, doctrines, or traditions alone. It rests on you. For centuries, many believers have been taught to approach Jesus primarily from a distance, to sing about him, pray to him, worship him, defend him, and there is beauty in devotion. But devotion was never meant to replace transformation. The tragedy is not that people worship Christ. The tragedy is that many stop there. What if the second coming is not merely an external event to wait for, but an internal awakening to participate in? What if Christ returning is not only about clouds in the sky, but consciousness rising within human hearts? That idea may sound bold, but it flows naturally from everything he taught. If the kingdom is within, if greater works are possible, if you are sent as he was sent, then the continuation of his life must happen through awakened people. Close your eyes for a moment and feel your breath. Feel your heartbeat. This is not just biology functioning automatically. This is life itself expressing through you. The same divine life that animated Jesus of Nazareth animates you right now. Not symbolically, not metaphorically, existentially. The difference is not access. The difference is awareness. To stop following in the old sense does not mean rejecting Jesus. It means taking him seriously. It means believing that when he said, "The kingdom is within," he meant it. It means trusting that when he said greater works would come, he was not exaggerating. It means accepting that his life was a template, not a trophy. The world does not need more passive admirers. It needs people who embody compassion in conflict, courage in uncertainty, forgiveness in a culture of resentment. It needs individuals who live as if divine love is not an abstract idea but a present force moving through their decisions. That is what an awakened being looks like. Not mystical escapism, but grounded transformation. You are not here by accident. The hunger you feel, the stirring that brought you to consider these ideas, is not random curiosity. It is recognition. Something within you resonates because something within you remembers. The invitation has always been there, woven into the words, waiting for a generation willing to move beyond surface belief. So the question stands before you, quietly but unmistakably. Will you remain a follower in the old paradigm, or will you step into becoming? Will you admire the light, or will you allow it to shine through you? Will you continue looking outward for permission, or will you recognize the kingdom within and live from it? The age of passive religion is fading. The call to conscious participation is rising. Not rebellion against faith, but fulfillment of it. Not abandonment of Christ, but embodiment of what Christ revealed. Stop following as dependency. Start following as transformation, and then go even further. Start becoming. The flame has never been extinguished, it has been waiting.